Joined here by Congressman John Lewis, among those on hand for that event. How many people were here for the march?
Well, the National Park Service said 250,000, but I do believe it was the greatest undercount of all time. When I look at still photographs, when I look at video, I think it was many more than 250,000. When you stood that day and looked down the mall, it was a sea of humanity.
And you were there. Let's show our audience this photograph of a 23-year-old speaker. You're the only sole survivor of the leading speakers from the March on Washington. What was it like for you when you stepped up to that podium?
Philip Randolph, who was the chair of the March on Washington, introduced me by saying, "I now present to you young John Lewis, the national chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee." I walked straight to the podium. I looked to my right and saw a group of young people, young activists from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the organization that I headed at the time. Then I looked to the left, I saw another group of young people up in the trees trying to get a better view of the podium. And I looked straight ahead and I just said to myself, I must go for it. And it was just unreal, unbelievable. We thought maybe 50 or 60,000 people would show up, but it was many, many more.
Your words, quote, "We will march through the South, through the streets of Jackson, through the streets of Danville, through the streets of Cambridge, through the streets of Birmingham, but we will march with the spirit of love and with the spirit of dignity that we have shown here today. We must say, wake up, America, wake up." What were you saying?
What I was trying to say, that we have come to Washington demanding change. We came to Washington on that day to petition our government, our president, members of Congress. And I wanted to try to display the sense of urgency. And as a matter of fact, early in the speech, I said we do not want our freedom gradually, but we want it, and we want it now. We were saying, in effect, that there would be no turning back, that we would not give up, that we would not give in, that we would not give out, that we were prepared not just to come to Washington, but also march in these other places all across America.
From your book, Walking with the Wind, you indicate that Martin Luther King was not the originator of the March on Washington idea. Who was?
The originator of the March on Washington was a man by the name of Philip Randolph. He was a black labor leader. He was considered the dean of black leadership. Philip Randolph had threatened a march during the Roosevelt administration.
And let me just stop you there. There's a photograph of him in the book. Is this him standing next to President Kennedy?
That is Mr. Randolph. You know, much earlier, during the summer 1963, we had a meeting with President Kennedy. I believe that meeting took place in the White House on, I will never forget it, on June 22nd, 1963. And it was in that meeting with Mr. Randolph and Dr. King and other leaders, the six of us. Mr. Randolph spoke up and said, "Mr. President," in his baritone voice, "we're going to have a march on Washington." And you could tell by the body language of President Kennedy, he didn't like what he heard. He started moving in his chair. And he said, "Mr. Randolph, if you bring all these people to Washington, there'll be violence, there will be chaos, disorder, and we will never be able to get a civil rights bill through the Congress." Mr. Randolph responded by saying, "Mr. President, this will be an orderly, peaceful, non-violent protest." We left that meeting with President Kennedy, came out on the lawn of the White House, announced to the media that we were planning a march on Washington.
And in the book, you say Mr. Randolph had a meeting 20 years previously with another president that ended in no march whatsoever. Can you explain?
Well, Mr. Randolph was able to negotiate an understanding with Mr. Roosevelt and with others. And he did not have the march, but he always looked forward. He always had this idea, somehow and some way, we should be prepared to use nonviolent protests. He negotiated with Roosevelt, with Truman, and with others.
Our guest, Congressman John Lewis, a Democrat from Georgia. Our phone lines are open at 202-585-3880 for Republicans and 202-585-3881 for Democrats, a line for independents, and for those of you watching outside the United States. How did the media portray this event back in 1963?
In 1963, most of the media said, in effect, 700,000 100,000 people had gathered in Washington for a march for civil rights, and that it was orderly and peaceful, and they highlighted the speech of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and rightly so.
What did you think of the speech by Dr. King?
I had heard Dr. King speak on so many occasions all across the South, but in other places in the North. And it was a wonderful speech, in my estimation. He started off slow, deliberate, and he got to the point sort of in the middle of the speech. He said, I have a dream today, a dream that is deeply rooted in the American dream. And he was talking to the people, and the people were talking back to him. I think it was a magnificent speech, and it will go down as one of the most powerful and one of the most influential speeches of all times.
But in your book, you said, in your opinion, it was not his greatest speech. Why?
Well, I had heard him. I've heard him speak in small churches, in rural communities. I heard him in New York, in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in Detroit. But the speech that I thought was his greatest speech, or his best speech, the one where he just spoke from his gut and his heart, and he felt so strongly about it. The speech he gave on April the 4th, 1967, 1 year to the date before he was assassinated, when he spoke out against the war in Vietnam.
Let me point to this photograph from your book and ask you about the Big Six. Who were they? This photograph from July 1963.
That photograph was taken on July 2nd, 1963 in New York City. That's where we issued the call for the March on Washington. The Big Six: A. Philip Randolph, labor leader; Roy Wilkins of the NAACP; James Farmer of CORE; Whitney Young of the Urban League; Martin Luther King, who was head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference; and young John Lewis.
With a little bit more hair back then.
I had hair, and I was a few pounds lighter.
Herndon, Virginia, for Congressman Lewis. Good morning.
Hello.
Go ahead, caller.
Hi, good morning, Congressman Lewis.
Good morning.
I just wanted to see if whether or not matter of fact, I'm forwarding a tape of the March on Washington I saw on PBS, that they had an organizer that organized the actual march, and I can't remember his name because I never heard of him until I saw it on PBS, and you might can help me. But he was standing next to Mr. Farmer, and he was standing next to Martin. And according to history, he was the original organizer. He had gotten arrested for some type of sexual act back in the days when nobody wanted to give him credit for it. And I just wondered if you knew his name.
The person that you're speaking of is Bide Rustin, who was the deputy director of the March on Washington. He was an aide and close confidant of A. Philip Randolph. Bide Rustin was brilliant, unbelievable as an organizer. He believed in the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. Without Bide Rustin involvement, we would have not been able to pull the March on Washington off.
As a matter of fact, this is a photograph from your book, and I also want to show our audience, if they want to pick it up from today's Arts and Ideas from the A section of the New York Times, is a photograph of Mr. Rustin at the moment of triumph, as it's being called, in August 1963 at the March on Washington. Next call is Westport, Connecticut. Good morning.
Good morning. I wonder why this is considered a partisan issue. This was an important historic event, important to all Americans, and yet the lines are divided, Republican and Democratic.
Well, the March on Washington was not a partisan issue. It was not Democrats or Republican. As President Kennedy said in June of 1963, the issue of race, the issue of civil rights is a moral issue.
Why was there any discussion for President Kennedy to come to the march? Because he was at the White House on that August day.
There was not any discussion on the possibility or any consideration of inviting the president to come. President Kennedy had some real reservation about the March on Washington. But you know, after the March on Washington, he invited us all down to the White House, and we had a wonderful meeting with him. He stood in the door of the Oval Office and greeted each one of us, and he said, "You did a good job. I'm so proud of you." He was almost like a father being very proud of his children.
Next call is from St. Louis, from a caller who was here 40 years ago. Good morning.
Hello. I was there. I lived in New York at the time, and it's something that I will never, ever forget. I'm 72. I talk to my grandchildren about them. I tell them about the march and about me going back, and then how important it is to keep up the fight.
Caller, let me ask you about how you heard about the march and how you made it down to Washington from New York at the time.
And you know, it was really strange. In New York, it was just all over. My husband worked at a factory, and they were the union was paying for their bus, and then he was going, and then we started listening to. I started listening to different people. I went with my church, and it cost us $4 from New York to Washington. We stood up all day long. After we got off that bus that morning, we left New York at 12 o'clock. We got in Washington, and we stood all day long. Do you know that I still have never been more elated, and I was not tired like you would think that you would be. You forgot the most wonderful thing that has ever happened, and yes, I agree. There were many more people than what the statistics will report. Thank you so much, Mr.
Mr. Lewis, thank you for the call. We appreciate it. What was it like here on that day? What do you remember about the conditions, the weather, and the crowds?
On that day, it was very, very hot. It was very hot. Hot August day in Washington. But the crowd, as the caller suggested, was calm. People stood. And for the most part, the crowd was so well dressed. It was unreal, especially those people coming from the heart of the South. For many of the African Americans coming from the heart of the Deep South, it was their first trip to Washington. So they felt they had to dress up. You saw men with jackets, women with wearing hats. It was wonderful. But one of the most amazing things that I saw, when you looked out over the crowd, you saw hundreds and thousands of people, white and black, taking off their shoes, putting their feet in the reflection pool to try to cool off.
What was the Student Nonviolent Coalition?
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was an organization that emerged during the spring of 1960 to coordinate the sit-ins, the nonviolent protests on the part of college students at all of the college campus. And we got sympathetic support from student groups in the North. It was based in Atlanta. I became the third chair in June of 1963. And 7 days rather, after I became the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I was invited to the White House to meet with President Kennedy along with the other 5 leaders.
And then 3 years after that march, Stokely Carmichael had you removed as the chairman of that committee. Why? Called SNCC.
It was called SNCC. It was called a SNCC, a short, I guess, for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of the press, Doug, was SNCC. And there was a feeling on the part of Stokely, Carmichael, and some other, that I was too close to Martin Luther King Jr., that I was too committed to the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. They didn't think I was militant enough or radical enough. They wanted me to take on Martin Luther King Jr., take on Lyndon Johnson as president. I disagreed with President Johnson on many things, but I was not going to get in a name-calling process or thing with Lyndon Johnson, with Dr. King. Dr. King was my friend. I was on his board, the board of SCLC. He was my leader. He was my hero. And I accepted the role as a participant. I didn't see myself as some great leader. I saw myself as one of the participants in the Civil Rights Movement.
Another look at the photograph. How long was your speech in August 1963? Do you remember?
No, I don't really recall the length, but I think my speech was only about maybe about 7 minutes. I think we all were supposed to limit our speeches to within 7 minutes.
Were you nervous?
No, I was not nervous. When I got up, I had what I call an executive session with myself. It's you shouldn't talk back to yourself, but I just said, "This is it. I'm going for it," and that's what I did. You know, there had been some controversy about my speech because I used a phrase in the speech where I said, "We are now involved in a serious revolution. The black masters are restless," and some people wanted me to delete the word revolution. And A. Philip Randolph came to my rescue and said, "There's nothing wrong with the word revolution. I use it myself sometime." And then near the end of the speech, they wanted me to change, and we did change it. I said, "If we do not see meaningful progress here today, the day may come when we will not confine our marching on Washington, but we may be forced to march to the South the way Sherman did, nonviolently." So we deleted that portion from the speech.
Next call is from Hutchinson, Kansas. Good morning.
Hello, Mr. Lewis.
Good morning.
I just wanted to tell you that even though I am a conservative Republican, I have great respect for you.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yes. And I have sort of followed you, through the marches and everything. I'm 75 years old. And I think that you should probably go down in history as one of the greats. And looking forward to monuments or something in your honor somewhere. And God bless you. Keep up the good work.
But God bless you. I don't want to see any monuments, anything like that built for me. I just try to get involved and do my best to make things better. Not for African Americans alone, but for all people. I've said over and over again that we're one people, we're one family, we're one house. We all live in the same house, and we must work together to build what I like to call the beloved community, a truly interracial democracy in America.
Good morning to Greensboro, North Carolina.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Representative Lewis, and thank God for longevity. Amen. I was there at the march that day, standing under the trees on the right-hand side of the podium. And I just wanted to ask you this. I watched the pledge, the dedication of the plaque yesterday, and I was literally brought to tears at the time that Dr. Martin, they played the excerpts from the speech at the time that you see it after the speech got so really in-depth and serious, and when most of the people had become quiet. And of course, I was crying then, and 40 years later, watching it and hearing it, I cried again. I was taken all the way back 40 years to that very time at the march. I wondered, did you have that same type of feeling?
Well, I must tell you, it was very moving yesterday, and each time I hear the speech, but to be there yesterday, I was brought to tears. I've been here in Washington for a few years, and I go to the Lincoln Memorial from time to time, to the Jefferson, to the Washington Monument, the Roosevelt, and you see these inscriptions, the sayings of our great leaders. And to stand there yesterday, to listen to the words of Martin Luther King Jr. 40 years later, and to see carved there in granite, "I have a dream," Martin Luther King Jr., the March on Washington, August 28, 1963. It was just too much for me. And I just wish that Dr. King and others who started on this march, on this journey, were still around to see the distance we've come, the progress we've made.
Our next call, Silver Spring, Maryland. Good morning.
Brother John Lewis, I look at you and I see Martin. God bless you for the beautiful things you do for black people and for our nation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for calling. We must continue to work for the day when we will no longer have to march, and work for all Americans and for all people, for all humanity.
Houston, Texas, you're next.
Yeah. Where have all the liberals gone? Let's see. Jesus Christ crucified. John Kennedy killed. Martin Luther King killed. Robert Kennedy killed. John Lennon killed. That's where they went. Thank you.
Among the photographs in your book and among the descriptions that you write about in detail, your work with Robert F. Kennedy and being at the Ambassador Hotel in June 1968.
Well, Robert Kennedy became someone that I admired, respected, and loved. I got to know him very well during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. As a matter of fact, I was with Robert Kennedy the night that we heard that Dr. King had been assassinated, April 4th, 1968. I was campaigning for him. And then after Dr. King's funeral, I went to California to continue to campaign for Robert Kennedy. And I was in his hotel room before he went down to give his victory statement. And he sort of joked with me. He said, "John, you let me down today. More Mexican American turned out to vote than Negroes." He was sort of joking. And he suggested that I remain there with others until he came back. And he made his victory statement. And a few minutes later, it flashed on television that Robert Kennedy had been shot. That was very sad. And I sort of said, what are we going to do? I cried a little. And I just wanted to get out of California, leave LA. And I got on a flight the next day and flew to Atlanta. And Robert Kennedy passed, and his family got in touch and suggested that I come to New York for the funeral mass and stand out under guard the night before the funeral. And attended the funeral. And after the funeral, boarded the funeral train and came to Washington to bury Robert Kennedy.
What do you remember from that speech on that April day of 1968 that Robert Kennedy delivered in Indianapolis?
It was, he did it. It was impromptu. He spoke from his soul. He spoke from his heart. He had a very soothing effect, I think, on that audience and on many people around the nation. He called on Americans, and African Americans in particular, not to resort to violence. He said that Dr. King was a man of peace, a man of nonviolence.
Next call is from Port Arthur, Texas. Good morning. Go ahead, caller.
Yes, Congressman Lewis, God bless you. Jackie Savoy from Port Arthur, Texas. I just wanted to say, because so many of our young people, and a lot of us, if we're a certain age, weren't a part of the movement, and relate back to, well, I really didn't know that this happened, and we don't teach the history. It's just so good to see that you're there, and you're still the lone person living, and you were such a hero in all of this that we can let youth see that you can go from youth to leadership. Sometimes it may seem like a facade to our children that believe in the values and the policies that you support. So I just hope God continues to bless you, that you continue to tell this story so that we do have this living history in you, and that youth that are 23-year-olds, and we have brilliant 23-year-olds of all colors and party backgrounds that believe that we should all live in this country and be judged not by the color of our skin, but the content of our character. And Congressman, it's a lot of places a member of Congress could be doing their break. They could be at home or in Crawford, Texas, like the president, but you're there being a living history to our country. And God bless you, and God bless this country, and God bless this 40th commemorative march.
But thank you very much for calling. I first heard of Martin Luther King Jr. when I was 15 years old in the 10th grade. I heard his voice on old radio. I heard his message, and he inspired me. And 3 years later, I met Dr. King. And it changed my life. And the only thing I would say to young Americans, to all young people, study the history of the movement and find a way to face that history. And we all can do something to make our country a better place. We just didn't go out one day and say we're going to sit in, or we're going to march, or we're going to picket. We organized. We studied. We studied the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. We didn't have a website. We didn't have a cellular telephone. We didn't have a fax machine. We believed in the Constitution. We believed in ourselves, and we had faith in our fellow man that we could do something, and we did it.
Nearly 2 years after the March on Washington and before the Civil Rights Bill was signed, Life magazine had a photograph of you and Dr. King on the cover. It was called Civil Rights Face-Off at Selma. The Savage Season Begins. Can you explain?
This is Selma, Alabama in 1965, and the young man standing beside me is Jose William, who was working for Dr. King. In Selma, Alabama, like so much of the South, in the early 60s, people of color could not register to vote. Had to pass a so-called literacy test, pay a poll tax. On one occasion, there was a black man who had a PhD degree, and he flunked the so-called literacy test. On another occasion, a man was asked to give the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. People had been beaten, some people shot, and some people killed. So in Selma, people had stood in unmovable lines for years to try to pass the literacy test, to become registered voters. My own mother, my own father, my own grandfather could not register to vote. I could not register to vote in my native state of Alabama. So we decided, after a young person had been shot and killed about 35 miles from Selma, Alabama in 1965, to march from Selma to Montgomery to petition Governor Wallace. And we set out to march in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion. And we were met by a group of Alabama state troopers where we were beaten. And that march from Selma to Montgomery created the climate, the environment where the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, came before a joint session of the Congress and introduced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Congress debated that act, debated the bill, the Congress passed it, and President Johnson signed it into law on August 6, 1965.
Bowie, Maryland, for Representative John Lewis of Georgia. Good morning.
Yes, hi. Good morning, Steve. Good morning, Representative Lewis.
Good morning.
I'm calling from Bowie. I'm not in your district, of course. I'm in Al Wynn's district, congressional district. But what I wanted to say to you this morning is I really do appreciate and admire what you and the Congressional Black Caucus is doing on Capitol Hill. I respect this history so very much. 20 years ago, I was involved with an organization that helped plan the 20th anniversary mobilization march for the March on Washington. So I really do respect our history. But I also realize that we have a future, and I look at you and I look at other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I look at what's going on in this whole world, and I realize, and in our country, that our fight is just not over. So I appreciate what you're doing, and I wanted you to know that in case you don't hear it enough from some regular people who work every day, who pay attention to what's going on in the world. Thank you.
Thank you for the call.
Thank you.
We'll move on to Atlanta, Georgia. Good morning to you.
Hello, this is Carolyn Godfrey, and I live in John Lewis's district. I am registered as a Republican, but I vote for John Lewis at every election he runs in. He's done a wonderful job for our district. The most important thing that I appreciate from him is as he's gone on to Washington, he has not forgot the people he served. He's very much involved in our district. I have talked to his office on numerous occasions about problems and always got a response and letters. And it's just so nice to see someone that goes to Washington that still stays in touch with the people that he is serving. And he does a wonderful job here, and I'm proud to live in his district. Our fight now is not so much, I don't think, against blacks and whites as it is against the working class and the wealthier class, and the broadening that's coming from that is getting to be a broader distance between the two, and I appreciate his efforts there.
Well, thank you so much for calling. When you come to Washington sometime, please come by and visit with me. I agree with you so much, and I really appreciate your calling. You know, when Dr. King was assassinated, April 4th, 1968, he was trying to organize all segments of the society that had been left out and left behind. The last time I saw Dr. King alive was in Atlanta, where he had brought together low-income whites and blacks and Hispanics, Asian American, and Native American. And I agree, the struggle is the people that are at the bottom, that are hurting. We need to do something about health care. We need to protect and save the environment. The environment is not, protecting the environment is not a issue of race. It's not white or black. All of us should know what is in the food we eat, what is in the water we drink, and what is in the air we breathe.
Let me go back to A. Philip Randolph, who, from this photograph in the center, standing next to Dr. King, and as you say in your book, was the originator of the idea of the March on Washington. But did these 6 individuals, yourself included, have a different view on what the goal of the march should be?
As a group, this is unreal. This is really unreal. As a group, we agreed. There was a sense of, it was a consensus. There was unbelievable solidarity. Dr. King had emerged as a symbol, as the undisputed leader, because he had the ability and the capacity to bring more people together. But it was A. Philip Randolph that had the capacity to hold us together. In some of those meetings, Mr. Randolph would say, when somebody sort of went off, he would say things like, if you cannot say something good about somebody, don't say anything. And I've said in recent days that if A. Philip Randolph had been born in another country, on another continent, maybe of another race, he probably would have been king, prime minister, or president. This was an unbelievable human being. And he was just a good, decent man. And he wanted to help all people, especially working people, blacks, white, Hispanic, Asian American, Native American.
Next call is from Minneapolis. Good morning.
Good morning. You know, I knew 2 people who were at the march. I was at the march on the left side under the trees, but I had 2 college roommates, 2 college acquaintances, John Barber and A.D. King. I wonder if you would comment. I was also in Montgomery during the problems in Montgomery in 1956. I sure would appreciate if you would comment on these 2 people and their role in the March on Washington, A.D. King and John Barber. John Barber was a speechwriter for King. Would you comment on those 2? You never hear their names, and I'd like to know something about their role.
Well, thank you very much. A.D. King was Dr. King's brother. And John Barber, I remember both John Barber and A.D. King very well. They played supporting roles. Dr. King, during his lifetime, will always speak about the ground crew, those who make things happen, those who get out there without their names appearing in a paper or faces on television, and just doing the hard, nitty-gritty work. And hundreds and thousands of our citizens, black and white, did the dirty, nitty-gritty work, making signs, getting water, food, bailing people out of jail. And we all are very grateful and thankful for the ground crew.
Page 226 of your book, Their Stories, the media portrayed the event as a big picnic, a hootenanny combined with the spirit of a revival prayer meeting. Too many commentators and reporters softened and trivialized the hard edges and pain and suffering that brought about this day in the first place.
I think many members of the media did not connect the march with the climate, with the environment that existed in America just before the March on Washington. Bull Connor had used dogs and fire hoses. Bull Connor was the police commissioner in Birmingham, Alabama. He used dogs and fire hoses against peaceful, nonviolent protesters. A NAACP leader, Medgar Evers, had been assassinated in Mississippi. Hundreds and thousands of people had been arrested, jailed, some beaten, and some killed. So the march just didn't come out of some day we decided to march. I think when we arrived in Washington, with the speeches, with the music, people saw it as so orderly, so peaceful. Some people expected chaos, disorder, expecting violence. But it was one of the most peaceful gatherings of such a crowd probably in the history of our country.
Why August 28th? Any significance to that particular day?
I don't think we had any reason for selecting August 28, 1963, but I think it was August 28, 1955, that a young black man from Chicago by the name of Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi. And I'm not sure people had that day in mind or not, but between July 2nd in 1963 and August 28, 1963, I think we felt that we had enough time to organize and to mobilize people to get there. And it was amazing to me. There was a young lady who was coordinator of transportation by the name of Rochelle Horowitz, who were working with A. Philip Randolph and Bob Rusty. And you can call her up at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, Rochelle, how many buses coming from New York? How many buses coming from Philadelphia? How many people are going to be on that train coming out of New Orleans to Jackson, Mississippi, to Birmingham, to Atlanta, and on to Washington? And she could tell us that. So it was organized. It was disciplined.
Next call from somebody who was there as we look at more scenes. This from the mall here in Washington and the south lawn of the White House. And there's the Lincoln Memorial. Jacksonville, Florida. You're next.
Hello. I just wanted to remind Mr. Lewis, Senator Lewis, that there were a lot of West Indians and Jamaicans that participated in that march, and I'd like for that to be recognized because we were there with Martin in St. Augustine. We were there with him in the, on the march. We were insignificant. We didn't play any part in the organization, but we were there as the ground troops. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you very much, and I agree. Many citizens of all kind, West Indies, made it to Washington from Florida, from New York, especially from Brooklyn, from Harlem, from all over America. And thank you for all of your wonderful work and involvement.
Fort Polk, Louisiana. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling from Fort Polk, Louisiana. Again, good morning, Republican John Lewis. I'm calling because I'm considered one of those vivacious baby boomers, early 30s, strong-willed black woman. And actually, I understand the March on Washington, but seem to be ridiculously frustrated. And I feel that although we have obtained our freedom, we still have a long way to go. The blacks, minorities, the women, men, we're still being grossly discriminated against, not only in our fair share of freedom in America, but overwhelmingly in employment and promotions, etc. Sir, the civil rights movement, it fared well in the late 60s, but I feel that the amendment or our Civil Rights Act does not protect the minorities nor the blacks in the year of 2000. I feel this because the racism and the discrimination is practiced more than today than in 1963.
Well, I'm not sure you said, and I appreciate you calling. I'm not sure I understood you. You didn't say Republican, John Lewis. I'm a Democrat. I represent Georgia, the city of Atlanta in the 5th District, and I've been in Congress 17 years, and I'm a pretty liberal, progressive Democrat by my record. But for those of you who think that nothing has changed, things have changed. In 1963, we still had those signs that said white men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. Segregation and racism was open, very overt. And if you don't believe anything has changed, come and walk in my shoes, and I'll show you we live in a different world. The scars and stains of racism may be still with us. We're not there yet. We have not yet created the beloved community or truly interracial democracy, but we own our way. And we're not going back. We're not going to stand still. We're going to continue to make progress and build a beloved community, build a society that is at peace with itself. That is the direction of the American society. Where we see discrimination, where we see racism, where we see people being discriminated against because of their gender or sex or sexual orientation or whatever, we have to speak out against it. we all have to act. We all can make a contribution. We don't need to wait for another Martin Luther King Jr. to come along. We all have to be part of our own liberation.
40 years later, is that your message today at this march?
My message today will be that, really. That it's not enough for us just to look back. It is good to look back, to be renewed, to be inspired, to see what another generation did. But it's also important for people to say, well, they did it, we cannot do it. We all can do something. What is happening in America today, I think too many of us, not just young people, all of us, are too quiet.
You talked and wrote about this speech earlier, and we have an email from a viewer who says, Mr. Lewis, I know you are peaceful and a diplomatic man, so you might be reluctant to explore the impact of the Riverside Church speech on the forces in the country, which might have contributed to Dr. King's assassination. That is why it is minimized in the press, who wishes to stress the dreaminess of the I Have a Dream speech, important as it was. Please comment.
The speech at the Riverside Church was one of the most moving statements of Dr. King. He talked about violence in Vietnam and violence here at home. And he said, I cannot segregate my concern, I cannot segregate my morality. He condemned the violence in Vietnam and condemned the violence here. And he said, in effect, what President Eisenhower has said much earlier, that when we spend hundreds, thousands, and billions of dollars on bombs, missiles, and guns, we're robbing our people. And there must be a better way. He was urging us to lay down the tools and instrument of violence and study war no more.
Another email from a viewer in Kansas City with this comment. It's sad the civil rights movement has devolved from a demand for equal rights, with which no decent person can argue, into a demand for extraordinary rights, like affirmative action and hate crime legislation. The present civil rights movement is a corrupt embodiment of Dr. King's dream that black Americans would simply enjoy the same rights and responsibilities as other citizens.
The civil rights movement today, it is not just about civil rights. It is about the rights of all of our citizens. We still need that concept, the policy of affirmative action, to include all of our citizens that have been left out or left behind or not included, whether they've been discriminated against because of race or gender. We have to affirm their inclusion, their involvement, their participation. I'm not prepared to give up on that idea of the beloved community, on open and just society.
Hillside, New Jersey, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm a black Republican woman. I was at the March on Washington. It cost $10 to go down on the bus those many years ago. I'd like to see more openness and receptivity between parties, the Republican and Democratic parties. Specifically, I'd like to see less negative name-calling and more involvement across the party lines. I want to praise you, Representative Lewis, for your calmness, for your sweetness, if I might say that, for your tenacity, your enthusiasm, and your work. And I'd like to call attention to the fact that down through the years, women have played a very important role. They've held the homes together while the men were out there, and many women were out there too. I'd like to see you take leadership in the area of harmony between Republicans and Democrats, especially black Republicans. I'm a lifetime member of the NAACP. And many years ago, my dad was the first black person to be nominated to run for Congress on the Republican ticket in the 11th Congressional District. When he would go to organizations, especially NAACP, they wouldn't even call his name. And it was because he was a Republican. I think that that kind of ridicule and ostracism and shutting out can't help the fight.
Caller, what was your dad's name?
Bill Stubbs.
Okay.
And I'd like to see Representative Lewis take some leadership in trying to harmonize between factions.
Thank you, caller.
Well, thank you very much for calling. I tell you, since I've been in Congress, I co-chair a group here in Washington on the Hill called Faith and Politics with a wonderful friend of mine. We came to Congress together, Congressman Emil Holton from upstate New York. and he's a Republican. And before Congressman J.C. Watts left the Congress, we worked very, very well together. We introduced legislation together. We co-sponsored the African American Museum. We co-sponsored legislation to do something about ending the disparity in health between the minority and the majority population. I don't believe in name calling. I believe in the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence, that we have to work together and pull together. In the final analysis, as I've said so many times in so many speeches, maybe, just maybe, we all came to this great land in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now.
Richmond, Virginia, for Congressman John Lewis, who at the age of 23, one of the speakers at the March on Washington, an event that will be commemorated today, and you'll be able to watch it live here on C-SPAN this afternoon. Go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Kim Shepperson. My pop served in the Air Force, and I considered him a pretty wise man. It's just amazing. Here I am, 44 years old. I was 3 when Martin was assassinated and Kennedy was in president, and we used to ride with my dad when we were in the truck, and we used to see how the country was and how the prejudice was, and sometimes we had to stay inside the truck. And I'm 44 and I have 6 children alive, very intelligent children, and the world today is still so racist against the people of minority color. I really can't believe that my entire life we're still fighting this issue. Here it is, we were released from slavery in 1865, and we're still fighting an issue as sad as racism is.
John Lewis?
Well, I appreciate you calling, but I tell you, there are people working, not just government officials, not just members of Congress. Again, as a congressperson, a senator rather, Senator Brownback from the state of Kansas, we've been championing an effort to create a national African American museum on the Mall. Because it is our feeling that if we tell the story, the whole story of the history of African American in our country, it will help lead to reconciliation and to healing. We have to deal with the problem of race, but you shouldn't get lost in the sea of despair. You shouldn't become bitter or hostile. I went to jail 40 times. I was beaten, left unconscious during the Freedom Rides in May of 1961. Had a concussion at the bridge in Selma on March 7, 1965. And some of my colleagues and friends in the Congress asked me, why you're not bitter? Why you're not hostile? You don't have time to be hostile. You don't have time to be bitter. We all have a role to play, and we should play it well. Do our part, not just to make America better, but to make our world, to make our little planet a better place for unborn generations.
Here's a scene from the book that John Lewis authored, Walking with the Wind, just moments before Alabama state troopers attacked us on the bridge, as he wrote from Walking with the Wind. We'll get a call from Montgomery, Alabama. Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Lewis, and to your host in America. I just want to say that I'm really enjoying the benefits of the things that you all did in the 1960s, so I could have the freedom. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about you just for a minute. When I met you in Montgomery, Alabama, at my church at First Baptist, you made me feel like I was the only person in that church when you met me. You stopped and you talked, and I tell you, I went home, and it just made such an impact on me. And I just want to say that as a young black man, I respect you so much. I'm just so glad. I cherish that day that I met you. And just to everybody who's listening, I know about the political things that you do, but I will never, ever in my life forget the way you caused me to feel in that church when I got off that pipe organ playing. And I know y'all were tired. Y'all had been up a long time. Chris Tucker was there. I know that y'all were hungry, and I know a lot of things, but I'm just saying to you personally that I really respect you, John Lewis, and I just want you to know that. And I'm looking forward to the day I can see you again. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for calling. In 1958, when I was 18 years old, I first met Dr. King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy at that church, First Baptist, and I grew up only 50 miles from Montgomery, so I have fond memories each time I visit First Baptist in downtown Montgomery and visit the city of Montgomery. Thank you for calling.
This viewer says it's an understatement that leading the civil rights movement was more than a full-time job. How did you and the other leaders of the movement survive financially?
Steve, I must say it was not easy. It was very difficult. When I became chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in June of 1963, I didn't have any major obligation. I only needed a place to sleep. I had a little apartment in Atlanta, and I shared it with a wonderful photographer by the name of Danny Line, who was from New York, who became this photographer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And we paid something like $90 a month, and the organization helped us. We were paid something like $10.50 a week when the taxes and everything was taken out. And people all across the country supported us in terms of travel from one place to another. And when we got arrested and went to jail, there were some very good people in Georgia, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Tennessee, and all across the South, and all across America, who raised money to help bail us out of jail.
We've showed this photograph. If we can go down, though, I want to read what Danny Lyon wrote to you from August 1963, Washington, D.C., on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial for my friend John Lewis on that hot summer day. It was your speech that we all waited to hear, because you were more than anyone else that day speaking for all the young people of SNCC, known as SNCC, or the South, or the high schools, that created the movement that caught the attention of the world and inspired a generation of progress and revolt.
I'm very grateful to Danny Line for writing that. Danny made a great contribution just using his camera. And it was very dangerous during those days to have a camera, to have a pencil and a pad, to be a member of the media, because people in the heart of the Deep South didn't want the message to get out.
Who were all these people around you? Do you know?
Many of those people were marshals, labor leaders, union workers, members that were there in support. And that several members of Congress came to the march and stood and took seats also on the steps in front of the podium.
Orlando, Florida, good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. How you doing today?
Good morning.
I just want to mention to say that I think the great thing about the March on Washington was I think the speech is still prevalent even today. When Martin Luther King was talking about a dream, I always see that he had the vision of even how our country should be years later. And I think about how, you know, the scripture says, without a vision, the people perish. But like you were saying, Representative, it's always good to look back to see where everything started, but to pick up and carry it on the way that I think Dr. King really envisioned, even in today after 9/11, when people come together, and as a country, we need to come together, heal these wounds. And I think that was what was so prevalent about his speech, that it's even a today speech that we should adhere to. And I just want to thank you for being a part of it and, you know, for laying the foundation.
Another caller from Roxborough, North Carolina, as we look at more scenes from that date in August 1963. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. Representative Lewis of course, I'm caught on the Republican line, and mainly the reason I vote Republican is mainly for their moral issues. I want to say that I appreciate the work that you've done. You know, before I was even born, I was born in '67, and you know, it shames me in a sense that it took our country nearly 200 years to try to get things right for all of our citizens. And you know, when we look at the Declaration of Independence, where it says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, I cannot understand how our forefathers could not, upon our country's freedom in the Revolutionary War, didn't make everybody free. But, you know, besides that, I want to ask you, what do you think difference would have been if Martin Luther King Jr. had not tragically been assassinated?
Well, thank you for calling. If Martin Luther King Jr. had not been assassinated, and President Kennedy had lived, and Robert Kennedy, and many others, I think we would be much further down that road toward the building of a truly interracial democracy. Dr. King had emerged as a moral leader, and perhaps more than any other American of our time, he had the power to bring more people together to do good, not just African American, but all people. Dr. King was the undisputed symbol of what was good and right about America. And he wanted to move America much further. And with the help of individuals like President Kennedy and others, we would have been able to do so.
Charleston, South Carolina, you're next. Good morning for Congressman John Lewis of Georgia.
Good morning, Representative Lewis, and to the host. I just want to say thank you, and I commend you for all your hard work, and also for all our forefathers, Dr. Martin Luther King, and all the participants of the march, and for everything that you've done for us. I just want to say thank you, and I just wish that I was there to see all the great things that had happened for the march, because it just looked like it was so peaceful and so calm.
Thanks for the comment. Last call from Houston, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Lewis, this is Mr. Strozier calling. I'd like to thank you very much for what you've done, what you've stood for over the years. I'm proud to be an African American, and I'd just like to say to you, sir, I don't think there is a civil rights movement today. It just seems as though African American people have just given up, and there's no fight in them. It seems as though all of our so-called civil rights organizations are speechless today. They're not dealing with the issues pertaining to the injustices done to African Americans, particularly African American men.
Thanks for the call. We'll get a response.
Well, thank you very much for calling. I said earlier, and I said to you, you must never give up or give in or give out. You have to continue to hang in there. Another generation of young people, and no one called us up and told us to go and start sitting in, get on a bus and go on the Freedom Ride, or start marching. We were deeply inspired by the words of Martin Luther King Jr., deeply inspired by our history books of what we knew about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. And we had to act, we had to move. And I think today in America, not just African Americans, but all of us are just a little too quiet. We're a little too complacent. We have to get involved. We need to register, and we need to go out and vote. We need to get involved in political campaign, in civic organization, doing things because it's the right thing to do. You don't need to wait on someone to come down from Atlanta or from New York to help from another part of the country. You have to do it. In the South during the early 60s, indigenous leaders emerged. Young people, high school students, college students just got out there and got in the way. They start pushing and pulling. And that's what people must do today.
Do marches work today?
I think marches still work. Dr. King used to say, there's nothing more powerful than the marching feet of a determined people.
Congressman John Lewis, who's been in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1986 and will be at the Lincoln Memorial later today to commemorate the 40th anniversary. You're always gracious with your time here at C-SPAN. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for all your good and great work.